Welcome to another week, and this week's Tips on Tuesday, we're going to be looking at a really important piece of kit maintenance that very often gets overlooked. If ever you need to cut away, you need to make sure that your cutaway system is going to operate correctly. So what we're going to look at now is how to make sure you clean and service it so that it will work when it's needed to. So this is the result when you don't service your freewheel system regularly. If you look at this rig, it's been sitting in the packing shed for a while, and what you can see is when we cut away, it's actually quite difficult for the risers to disconnect. They may well go under load, but there's a good chance that they may hang up and either not disconnect or disconnect one side before the other. So you can see here that the webbing tends to hold the shape that it's in and forms a set in that position. That means it's very difficult for the rings to then be flexible enough to flip through each other and disconnect when you've removed the cable. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to clean up the risers and get rid of all the grime and muck that builds up in that fold where the risers are set. So we're going to use a stiff brush, and we're basically just going to give each part a clean. So start with the loop, and as we do that we also flex it so it gets a bit of its flexibility back again, and then we just use the brush to scrub all the muck out from between the rings and the webbing. Now as you're doing that, take hold of the ring and just twist it side to side and up and down just to help reflex the webbing and take that set out. Make sure you get right in there with the brush on both rings and on both sides. Once we've cleaned up both sets of risers, we're then going to turn our attention to the cutaway cables and the cutaway pad. So first of all, I'm going to inspect it just by running my fingers up and visually inspecting the cables, looking for any damage, any nicks or anything sharp that might cause a problem if we have to cut away. And as I'm doing that, you can see some of the dirt and grime that's built up where it sits in the cutaway housings over that sort of several months between repacks that most people leave it before they service. Having done that, I'm then going to take some silicone spray, in this case. Teflon spray is also usable, and even just some neat alcohol spray that you can use just to clean the grime off. So I'm just going to spray the cables liberally with that, and then take a nice clean cloth. I'm just going to rub cables through the cloth to remove all the dirt. And you can see now, just looking at the cloth, how much dirt you've actually removed from those cables. Now, this rig was serviced, had its reeling service about 6 weeks ago, so there's not an awful lot of build of dirt on there. But you can imagine if it's been sat there for 6 months between reserve repacks, just how much dirt and grime fixes itself to those cables. So now everything's nice and clean, I'm then just going to fit the cutaway cables back into the housings. So this is a good time also to check that the housings are connected correctly, so that they are stitched and connected to the harness, and they're not going to move unnecessarily if you need to cut away. I then start off by slide the smaller cable or the shorter cable into the shorter housing, and then the longer one, thread it through all the way around the longer housing so it comes out the other side, and I'm now ready to connect my 3-ring. So now I'll just reconnect the cutaway pad onto the Velcro in its little pouch, and at the same time I'm making sure that I've got the minimal amount of exposed cable that's possible. So there's very little between the bottom of the cutaway housings and the top of the cutaway pad. So I reassemble the 3-ring system on each side, one side at a time, and the way I always teach my students to remember it is that the middle ring goes through just the big ring, the small ring goes through just the middle ring, and then the loop comes down through just the small ring, through the grommet and the risers, and then the cutaway housing fitting sits over the loop and the cable goes through the loop to lock it off. So big ring, middle ring, little ring, piece of string, yellow thing. Once I've assembled the 3-ring system, I'm just going to check the tolerances. Now they're very tight, especially on a small ring system. I should be just about able to move the cutaway housing around 90 degrees to the side of the riser and not much further than that. So that way there's not an excessive length of nylon loop, but there's enough flexibility in the system to allow the loop to come through. So once both risers are back onto the harness and the 3 rings are correctly assembled, I'm now going to carry out a line sequence check, because it's a bit embarrassing if you open your parachute and find that it's flying backwards. So starting off with the rear risers, I'm checking the steering line is clear all the way through the slider, all the way up to the top where it cascades out to the back corners of the canopy. And then on the rear riser, starting with the outside line, I make sure that line's clear. The next line attached to the riser should be the second line in, and then the next one the third, and so on right the way across that side of the canopy. I can then do the same on the front risers on that side. So again, the outside line on the riser attaches to the outside line point on the canopy. The next one is the next line in, and so on and so forth. And then I check both sides to make sure that all the lines are clear and the parachute's ready to then pack and jump. So that's it for another week. Hope that was useful. Make sure you clean and service your 3-ring system. I'd say at least every 2 months, if not monthly, but certainly at some point between reserve repacks. That way, when you need it to work, you know it's going to work. Enjoy your jumping, stay safe, and I'll see you next week.